The 20s, an era of drastic social and economic change in American society. Women were granted suffrage nationwide, automobiles took to the streets, and the country was swiftly recovering from war due to a rapid growth in consumerism. Many historians would regard the decade as one of prosperity, an upward incline that would eventually come to a screeching halt as a result of the 1929 stock market crash. The crash, often deemed one of the U.S.'s most pressing moments, brought tremendous hardship upon the American people and launched the nation into the Great Depression. However, what many Americans at the time and most now remained oblivious to is that Osage County, Oklahoma, had been engulfed in a cloud of depression for years. Innocent men and women were slaughtered, their properties and finances seized, and their stories cast aside in the name of black gold and greed. The Osage people were originally dispersed across the central United States, but eventually were forced to cede most of their land to the U.S. government in the 1870s. They relocated to barren land they purchased in Oklahoma, in hopes that they would be left alone. As a semi-nomadic people, they had very traditional practices of hunting, while also being very mindful and purposeful of the way they dressed, adorning beautiful beads and even symbolic tattoos. Conversely, they were also a progressive tribe comprised of gardeners and foragers who created an agrarian and structured society. Little did the Osage know, the wealth flowing beneath their land would soon change their history. At the turn of the century, the Osage Nation struck oil on their reservation land. Though the process began slowly, production began to boom in 1907, when the Osage oil fields produced over 5 million barrels. The tribe was able to retain collective ownership of the surface mineral rights, so each member of the tribe received a head right that granted them an equal share of the oil profits. The head right could not be bought or sold, only inherited. In 1923, the tribe collectively received $30 million in head rights, the equivalent of roughly $400 million today. The public was shocked that a community of Indians had managed to become the wealthiest people in the world. Blinded by their own prejudices, many white people refused to accept that indigenous people lived in lavish mansions, owned expensive cars, and employed white servants.
They were criticized because people were jealous that they had all this money, and who were they to spend it? They couldn't speak English, they weren't white, they didn't deserve it, and yeah, they made a mockery of their wealth.
The frustration at the success of the Osage was made even more evident with the implementation of financial guardianship laws, in which white guardians were appointed for Osage individuals who were presumed to be incapable of managing their own finances. In reality, these guardians were imposed on any Osage who was less than 50% white. This system eventually led to embezzlement and profiteering, with judges giving guardianship to prominent citizens in return for campaign support, and guardians forcing their wards to buy goods from them at inflated prices. Nefarious white settlers began to move to the Osage Reservation in order to profit off of what they referred to as the Indian business. But no matter how much money the scammers made from the Osage, they couldn't touch the source of their wealth. The oil head rights themselves couldn't be taken except by inheritance. Life of the Osage continued as the boomtown phenomenon took hold in Osage County. New towns were built up as settlers poured into the area and existing ones began to bustle with activity. Bars and hotels popped up throughout the area. But everything soon came crashing down. On May 27, 1921, the body of Anna Brown, a member of the Osage tribe, was found in a ravine in Osage County. Brown was young and frequented the bars in the area, so it was initially thought that her death had been due to alcohol poisoning. However, an autopsy proved that she'd been shot. The body of another Osage, Charles Whitehorn, was discovered the same day. Whitehorn was a cousin of Anna Brown. 2 months later, Brown's mother, Lizzie Kyle, died. Kyle had inherited head rights from her late husband and daughter. Her 2 living daughters, Molly Burkhart and Rita Smith, became even more wealthy from her estate. On February 6, 1923, Henry Rowan, another cousin of Anna Brown, was found dead. A month later, Rita Smith and her husband were killed by a bomb placed in their home. In June of the same year, George Bighart and his attorney, W.W. Vaughn, were both killed. 24 local people died from 1921 to 1923, most of them either Osage or local white settlers who were trying to help the tribe look into the mysterious deaths. The world went on to fail the Osage in their quest for justice. From a bureau of investigation that forced the Osage to finance efforts to crack the case with their own money, to the eventual pardon of one of the murderers, to J. Edgar Hoover, closing the investigation prematurely. However, there is no hope, as modern journalists and historians are working to shine some light on the events. At the time, laws in Oklahoma were enforced largely by local sheriffs who lacked the training necessary to conduct conclusive investigations. These sheriffs were also deeply corrupt and could easily be bought off. The Osage implored local authorities to investigate the deaths. However, little effort was expended towards finding the culprits. When it became clear local law enforcement would be of little aid, the Osage sought the assistance of federal investigators. The director of the Justice Department dispatched an agent from the newly created Bureau of Investigation to Osage County, but after a few weeks, he returned with a report that any further investigation was useless. More agents were dispatched, but they made no progress. Eventually, the Osage were compelled by the Bureau to fund part of the investigation with their own money, totaling around $20,000. Even the Osage-funded investigation managed little success. Desperate to avoid failure, the head of the Bureau, J. Edgar Hoover, turned the investigation over to his best man. Agent Tom White took the case in 1925 with a team of undercover investigators. White and his team worked quickly and methodically on a case that many saw as impossible. White quickly made a shocking discovery. Rancher William K. Hale, the so-called King of the Osage Hills, and the uncle of Molly Burkhart's husband, Ernest, may have been responsible for the murders. Hale had settled on a reservation nearly 20 years previously and built up wealth and power as his cattle ranch grew. He had a reputation of being kind and helpful to those around him, especially the Osage. He himself said in a letter, "I will always be the Osage's true friend." But Hale also had an obvious motive for at least one of the murders. He was the benefactor of Henry Rowan's $25,000 life insurance policy. Hale had previously seemed intent on placing the blame for the murders on another suspect, Roy Bunch. And with every murder, more headrights were being concentrated in the hands of Molly Burkhart. Hale was the uncle of Ernest Burkhart and would be able to inherit the headrights if Molly and Ernest were to die. The conspiracy became clear. In 1927, William K. Hale, Ernest Burkhart, and another conspirator, John Ramsey, were tried in federal court for the murder of Henry Rowan. It was revealed that Hale had manipulated his nephew into helping him conduct a number of murders, including the killings of Rita Smith and her husband. An outlaw named Kelsey Morrison was later arrested for the murder of Anna Brown. He had been hired by Hale. In November of 1929, William K. Hale was sentenced to life in prison for his crimes. Ramsey, Morrison, and Burkhart were given life sentences as well. However, each one of the murderers was eventually paroled, and in 1965, Ernest Burkhart was granted a full pardon. Though authorities had not been able to connect Hale to all 24 known murders, J. Edgar Hoover closed the investigation after his conviction. The quick, clean end to the case showcased the competency of the Bureau of Investigation to the public and allowed it to become the governmental force that the FBI is today. However, the closing of the investigation is not the end of these events. Hoover had acted prematurely.
They took care of what they needed to take care of. They did a little investigation to make it look like and that it was a good, clean-cut case. They found the person that did it, and that was that. But that really wasn't it. According to Gran in his book, there were other people involved.
In 2012, journalist David Gran visited Osage County in hopes of learning more about the Osage murders. After visiting historic towns and archives and speaking extensively with the Osage people, he discovered a shocking fact. The Osage murders extended far beyond the victims of William Hale. A granddaughter of W. W. Vaughn recalled to Gran that in her family's efforts to find out more about his death, they'd received an anonymous threat that if they continued looking into the murder, they'd all end up like W. W. Vaughn. After receiving the name of a suspect from her, a bank president named H.G. Burt, Gran used archives to piece together a portrait of Burt's swindling of the Osage. The discovery of the actions of Burt was only the beginning. Gran found evidence that Charles Whitehorn's wife had been complicit in his murder. He discovered a full account of the murder of another Osage, Mary Lewis, who was killed by a friend so that he could collect her headright payments. And he listed a countless Osage to tell him of a grandmother or grandfather that died in an unexpected death while under the care of a financial guardian. The full account of his research was published in 2017 under the title Killers of the Flower Moon, The Osage Murders and the Birth of the FBI. Historians and journalists like Gran are working to help the Osage finally bring some degree of awareness to the barriers that they have faced during their search for justice.